Welcome, everyone, to the 2023 UPRT Safety Summit for Professional Pilots Worldwide. I'm your host. My name is Clark McNeese for this first session, and we're so excited you have joined us for this event. We have a great lineup of sessions for you. This is session one, called Elevating Air Carrier Safety Risk Management to Counter Loss of Control in Flight. But remember, there are 3 more sessions after this, and you don't want to miss any of those. There's every topic about aviation going to be discussed, such as airline, corporate, general aviation, and even SMS safety managers. For this first session, we have 2 powerhouse industry leaders, Captain Brian Sims of Delta Airlines and Captain Brad Bennetts of Global Airways in South Africa. Brian of Delta is going to share about the significant safety improvement they have achieved through their UPRT efforts over the last 5 years and over 5 million flight operations. Brad of Global Airways will be sharing about a real-life airline upset that one of their crews had and the successful outcome. That was a direct result of the extensive UPR training they had, which was implemented by Brad at the airline. So I'll be your host throughout this first session. Just a quick note of my background. I started in general aviation 44 years ago, then flew in the Navy tactically. From there, went to the airlines for 10 years, flying Boeings. And then partnered with BJ, our CEO, about 18 years ago to help develop loss of control and flight mitigation strategies. And then this, of course, led to my involvement with some of the industry stakeholders involved in loss of control and flight mitigation, such as the FAA, EASA, and ICAO. And I got a chance to help in the development of some of their UPRT guidelines. It's been a fascinating ride for me, for sure, and that's why I'm excited to be working and hosting this particular session about airlines and what they can do to mitigate their threat. So to help me with this session, I've got joining me our CEO, Paul B.J. Ransberry, and Randy Brooks, our VP of Flight Ops. Thanks for joining me, guys. We're all going to be kind of sharing throughout these sessions in hosting. And I just was going to ask you guys, maybe BJ, what are you looking forward to maybe most about today?
Well, I mean, I'm excited about every session. I mean, this one is such a great one with the airlines. And I think it's a great example of prevention and recovery and its effectiveness with the proper program. And then the one I'm hosting next, which means I got to leave in a few minutes here, is going to be on the Corporate Executive Part 135, Strategic Mitigation of Loss of Control. And then, of course, I'll be joining everybody in session 4 to host that, where you guys are going to join me there and as many speakers as we can, and also the safety auditors. And so can I just talk about that auditor a little bit before I depart here? So everybody, please, if you're in this session and you haven't signed up or registered for session 4, I think you're going to find that really valuable. There's the QR code. You can go and that'll be a list of that session, and then you can join in there. But if this is the replay, you can also use the same QR code or just type in that URL to go join there and you know, be present as a wide diversity of experts. I think we're going to have nearly 10 people on that call for a panel to take us through safety risk management, UPRT solutions, SMS optimization. And it's going to start with 4 of the leading auditors in the world talking about their perspective on implementing UPRT. So any questions for me before I go, Auditor, and I'll leave it to you and Randy.
Oh, that sounds great.
All right, guys, good luck.
Thanks, BJ. Randy, what are you looking forward to about today?
Well, I think what's special this year, Otter, this is the 3rd year that we've had the UPRT Safety Summit online, and this year we've devoted a session to general aviation, and we really got some great speakers. We've got Rich Stoll, who really created emergency maneuver training, which morphed into upset recovery training. And then, reflecting the worldwide nature of this event, we have Shane Tobin of UPRT Australia joining us and I'll be moderating that session, our third session of today.
That's great. I'll just share what I'm looking forward to is the interaction that we get with our audience, because we get a lot of great comments and questions, and each of the sessions will have Q&A as well. And it's fun to hear from folks around the world for sure. All right, it's time for Randy to introduce our first speaker in this session.
Our first speaker for today's session on elevating air carrier safety risk management to counter loss of control in flight is Captain Brian Sims, the lead UPRT subject matter expert at Delta Airlines. In that role, Brian is responsible for ensuring the technical accuracy of UPRT presentations and information in the ongoing UPRT training requirements for all instructors and UPRT subject matter experts at Delta. Brian grew up around missionary flying in the bush of Southeast Asia before attending Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, where he worked as an instructor prior to graduation. His airline career began at Regional Airlines, where he flew for 10 years, 3 years as a first officer, and 7 years as a captain on a variety of Bombardier aircraft. At Delta, Brian has flown the Boeing 717, 757, and 767, and worked in the training department for 5 years, which led to his selection as the lead UPRT subject matter expert for Delta. I was fortunate to fly with Brian during his initial Train the Trainer UPRT qualification with APS in the Extra 300L, and since then Brian has received recurrent training with us in the Marchetti S211 all-attitude jet training aircraft. As you'll hear from Brian today, Delta has gone beyond the required basics of UPRT delivery by using data analysis to measure the effectiveness of their UPRT efforts. Their analysis shows conclusively that the results of properly administered UPRT, and that's the essential part, properly delivered, can make a significant impact on airline safety worldwide. It is truly an honor and a privilege to introduce to you Captain Brian Sims.
Well, thank you, Randy and Otter and BJ, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to all of you who are joining us this morning. I'm sorry I can't be with you live, but I'm actually in Southeast Asia this morning presenting UPRT to a group of missionary bush pilots that I grew up flying with. And so as much as I'm excited to be home, I'm also excited to be with you today and using this technology to share UPRT on multiple continents at the same time. For those of you who may have heard me speak at the UPRT Global Summit in May, some of this information will be familiar to you, but I'm going to approach it a little bit differently today, and specifically from the standpoint of risk mitigation and how we mitigate those risks here at Delta, and hopefully how you can do something similar in your operation. So the topics that I want to go through today are, first of all, where is the risk? How do you identify that risk in your operation? Once you do, taking a look at the trend analysis, and I'm going to share some examples of how we've done that at Delta and how effective UPRT has been at Delta Airlines. We're going to look at a topic that I think is really important right now in the industry, and that is the relationship between aircraft upsets and automation and overdependence on automation. We're going to talk a little bit about threat mitigation, and then finally some tools for improvement and how we are looking ahead at Delta and hopefully using these tools to improve safety. Okay, so the first thing that I want to discuss this morning is risk management. I think it is absolutely essential in any operation to identify where your risks are. And fortunately, air travel is one of the safest modes of transportation in the world. But unfortunately, we have quite a history of accidents in the industry, specifically related to loss of control. And you obviously, as a worldwide loss of control UPRT audience, are familiar with those statistics. But when we're looking at risk management at Delta, we first start there and we look at the accidents that have occurred in the industry and say, how did that happen? And how could we prevent that from ever happening here in our operation? Secondly, we look at internal incidents and approach it in a very similar way. No operation is perfect. We work in a very dynamic world of aviation. Weather's changing, aircraft are changing, people are changing. And so we try to identify the causal factors to the incidents and figure out how we could prevent that. We spend a lot of time looking at FOQA data, which comes out of the flight data recorders on the aircraft. Anytime we have an exceedance, that shows up, and we review that data. And then we kind of color that picture with the ASAP reports. And these are internal reports that our pilots provide to the operation, and it's all de-identified. But they explain to us what it was that occurred, and we read those and we help understand what had occurred on the aircraft for them and how to prevent that in the future. And then where I come in and my team comes in is as a subject matter expert. Delta requires that at all times we have a minimum of 2 subject matter experts on every single fleet. And those subject matter experts are instructors on our fleet, but they're also specifically trained by APS to deliver UPRT to the rest of our instructors, and then those line instructors deliver it to the line pilots. And so those are kind of the layers that we go through as we're initially approaching the topic of risk management. Moving on from there and kind of building on that subject matter expert idea is it's absolutely essential that we deliver high quality training to our pilots. And so one of the things that we do when we're delivering that training is we share the data with our crews, and we share that FOQA data, we share that ASAP data, we share the incident reports with our crews so that we can understand how a really good, highly qualified crew in a fully capable airplane working in a very controlled system like the National Airspace System could reach a point of an upset or ultimately a loss of control. We want to know how that happened, and so we share that with our crews. We then elevate that with an academic understanding. This may be connected to the aircraft systems, it may be related to the aerodynamics, but we want to understand from an academic perspective how that upset occurred. And then we train that to proficiency. First, how to avoid it, but then if you've done everything to avoid it and you still encounter an upset, we want to make sure that our pilots are proficiently able to recover from any upset that they may encounter. If you've heard me speak in the past, I think it's really important in aviation and in any training environment that we remember that there are 4 levels of learning. So at the very base level is rote memory. We have understanding, application, and correlation. And so building on that training, we want to make sure that our pilots are able to apply that training in the simulator and then correlate that simulator training or on-aircraft training when they go to the line and encounter the very dynamic environment that they're encountering on the line. So at Delta, anytime that we are briefing a phase of the operation, whether it's takeoff, approach, landing, go around, whatever it is, we brief the plan. But then at the end of that briefing, we always identify what the highest threat is that we're going to encounter in that particular phase of the operation. And then we brief a mitigation strategy. So we always have a plan if things don't go according to plan. And we fly like we plan. Again, it's a dynamic environment, and sometimes that plan changes. And so this is where flight path monitoring comes in. It's absolutely essential that both pilots monitor the flight path at all times. And if the flight path deviates, then we call that out to one another and we review the plan and we adjust as necessary. All right, I want to move on and share some of the data with you through trend analysis. And I do want to take an opportunity here to commend Delta. They have been very much at the forefront of training UPRT and tracking the data and identifying where the threats are. And UPRT has absolutely been effective at Delta Airlines. And the data that I'm going to share with you today, it's all de-identified, all the raw numbers have been removed. So everything that you're seeing is on a rate basis. And I'm sharing it only with you in the name of safety, because I want you to understand where we've come as an airline in the effectiveness of UPRT in our operation, and hopefully how it can be effective in your operation. So in 2018, we began tracking the upset data and the exceedances online at Delta Airlines. And in 2018, our rate of exceedance per 10,000 flights was in the neighborhood of 2.6 per 10,000 flights. At the fourth quarter of last year, so 5 years since we began tracking this data, that rate had dropped from 2.6 per 10,000 to 1.3 per 10,000. So almost exactly a 50% reduction in the rate of exceedances at Delta. And that is over 5 years and 5 million flights worth of data. Moving on from there, we drill down into each of the specific upsets that occurred. And as you can see there, the highest number of events that we've seen online have actually been in the over pitch, in the high pitch arena. We track high pitch, low pitch, and high bank. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of those events. But the high pitch, specifically on the 757, has been the leading upset parameter that gets exceeded. This is the stall warning data. And this particular chart that you're looking at here, I realize it's a bit of an eye chart, but this is only for the Boeing aircraft. I'm going to show you the alpha floor data on the Airbus aircraft in just a minute here. But this was a bit of a surprise. That red line there represents the 767 fleet at Delta, and that fleet has been head and shoulders above all the other fleets in stall warnings. And I'm going to talk specifically about where those events occurred, because they, by and large, occur at a very specific point in time. But it's been really helpful for us to understand what it is that's been causing those warnings. And I'm going to share with you some examples of things that we've done to mitigate that and hopefully bring those numbers down moving forward. This chart here is the Airbus data for alpha floor events. Surprisingly, the leading fleet on the Airbus side for alpha floor warnings has been the A350. And that was surprising because it's the biggest, it's the largest, it's the most technologically advanced aircraft that we have. And yet the rate basis is higher than any other Airbus fleet. And so that's been an opportunity for us to look at that aircraft and look at the way that we operate it and say, hey, do we need to make changes? And there have been some changes that we've made, and I think they're effective. All right, moving on from there, the relationship between upsets and automation is really, really important. And I understand that we have different airlines and different corporate operators and private operators all around the world that have different ways of flying the aircraft. But one of the things that I think is absolutely essential as an airline instructor who's been working with thousands of pilots over many years is I think it is absolutely essential that we maintain our hand flying skills, that manual flight be something that we train and something that we encourage in the aircraft as well under certain prescribed conditions. The high pitch events that you see there on the left side of your screen almost exclusively occurred with the autopilot off. It was pilots who were either distracted or following automation that was giving them data that they should not be following. The high bank angle and the low pitch events, we're going to talk a little bit more about those in a minute, but absolutely essential that we maintain our hand flying skills. Okay, this next chart here shows the percentage of the time that the autopilot was off during a high bank exceedance. So if I exceed 45 degrees of bank with the aircraft, this is the percentage of time that occurred with the autopilot off. These are really high percentages. In some cases, it was 100% of the exceedances occurred with the autopilot off. So on one hand, you could say, well, we need to use the automation. On the other hand, we really need to maintain proficiency, because if I get an aircraft upset or I have an aircraft that's lost control, I need to be able to manually get that aircraft back into the normal flight envelope very quickly and very proficiently. There's several reasons for why these numbers are so high. One of them is proficiency. One of them is distraction. And so that brings up a point. Anytime a pilot at Delta goes heads down, we're supposed to tell the other pilot, that I'm going heads down, whether it's to read a chart or to type in the FMS or to look up a piece of paperwork, whatever it is. And that raises the awareness of the other pilot to continually monitor the flight path. But again, hand flying skills are really, really essential. Okay, I'm going to give you some specific examples of where some of these upsets occurred and some common denominators that we've noticed and some things that we've done to hopefully mitigate against that. So on the 757, this was absolutely the leading aircraft when it came to nose-high exceedances. On one hand, it's an incredibly powerful, incredibly capable aircraft. On the other hand, if you don't effectively manage the energy of that aircraft and manage the automation, it can lead to an upset. So one of the things that we saw when we looked at that data was 99.5% occurred during the initial climb, and 95% of those were above 500 AGL. So what we determined was one causal factor is pilots were rotating too slowly. And as they began to rotate too slowly on the 757, that flight director would lead them to a very nose-high attitude in order to get the airspeed back to either V2 plus 15 to V2 plus 25. And so one of the things that we've done in training is identify that automation issue. But secondly, I've proposed a change to our publications that recommends that even if the automation is taking you above 20 degrees nose up, that the pilots stop at 20 degrees nose up and wait for that automation to settle down. Now, obviously, there's some caveats if ground contact were imminent or something else like that. But under normal operations, we would not want the pilot to exceed these really high pitch attitudes. The autopilot was off in all but one of those events. So again, just highlighting the need for manual hand flying proficiency. Nose low. This one was actually a bit of a surprise to us. So when we looked at the FOQA data, the Airbus 320 fleet, this includes the A319, 320, and 321, but the A320 fleet was the leading fleet for nose low events. In fact, 76% of all nose low events occurred on this fleet. And what was surprising was, one, that fleet was an outlier so far, but that 65% of those occurred with the autopilot engaged. And so that was an opportunity to go back to our instructors and go back to our line check airmen and to our subject matter experts and try to determine what the causal factors were. And I'm not an Airbus pilot. I'm a Boeing 7576 instructor. So I won't pretend to get into all the details. But one thing that we noticed, one thing that came out of the data as we were talking to the experts, was that it was often when the aircraft was high on the path for an initial descent, and the automation began to chase the speed in order to get the path back under control. And in some cases, it would exceed really nose-low attitudes. So even though automation is great, there are times that it needs to be managed very, very carefully, and that there are times when the automation needs to be disconnected and the pilot needs to take manual control. Okay, two more examples here. The first is on the 767. I mentioned this earlier. It was the leading cause of stall warnings on the Boeing fleet, and specifically the 767-300. And when we looked really closely at the data, what we determined was that at one point, the 767-300 accounted for 51% of the stall warnings at Delta. That fleet only makes up 4% of the entire Delta fleet. And so when you have 4% of the fleet that's causing 51% of the warnings, that was a really startling number. And then we looked a little closer at the data and we determined that not only did it account for that high percentage, but it occurred almost 75% of the time between flaps 1 and flaps up on the flap retraction phase after takeoff. That is an incredibly specific period of time that lasts, 10 to 15 seconds after takeoff. And so one of the things that we've done is we have asked Delta to upgrade the flight decks to electronic flight displays. So we're going to take the old manual airspeed indicators, and we're going to keep those, but we're going to upgrade the flight decks so we also have speed tapes available. so the pilots can see their proximity to stall warning as those flaps are being retracted. And just quite honestly, the awareness that the pilots have that that's such a high threat period of time in the flight, if we can get all hands on deck and everybody paying attention to the maneuvering speeds and the air speeds and the flap retraction speeds, that's a win for us. Okay, the A350 is the second example that I want to share here. And I'm going to talk again about this at the end, but the A350, if you'll remember, was the leading Airbus fleet for alpha floor warnings. And one of the things that we determined was that it's temperature sensitive at higher altitudes than we initially thought. And so we've offered some guidance to our pilots on that, and I'll share that with you at the end. All right, so threat mitigation. All this data that we have, that's great, but how do we use that? So I'm going to give you some examples here of how we mitigate those threats in the academic world when we're sharing this information with our pilots. So the example you see there on the left is just an old style airspeed indicator. This is what is currently on our 7576 fleet that's going to be updated. And what I'll do when I'm taking a pilot, particularly through initial training, is I'll show them this airspeed indicator. And I realize it may be a little hard to read on your screen, but I'll just give you the numbers. At a given weight, that particular airspeed indicator that you're looking at, that aircraft has a 1G stall speed of approximately 200 knots. And so I'll take the pilot through the progression on that airspeed indicator and say, okay, if I increase my bank angle to say 30 degrees, this is how much the stall speed increases on that airspeed indicator. Or if I roll it over to 60 degrees of bank, or if I get a wake turbulence event and try to put 2.5 Gs of airplane G on that wing, how much that changes the stall speed. And I can change the stall speed of that aircraft with the angle of attack and with the G load anywhere from 200 knots to almost 290 knots before I exceed the load limit of that wing. But I wouldn't be able to tell that looking at the airspeed indicator, because all I see is the speeds. I don't see any speed tape information at all. But if I increase the G load, immediately I get into stick shaker if I'm not careful. So we'll walk the pilot through those numbers and help them understand how much margin they have on that wing. With the flaps and slats, the one there in the center column, we'll talk about the relationship between flaps and slats and how that changes the angle of attack and how it changes the chord line. On the 76300, when I retract the flaps from flaps 1 to flaps up, I lose almost 30% of my margin to stall warning, my margin to critical angle of attack when I do that. And right at that point in time when the slats are retracting and I'm losing 30% of my margin, that is the precise point at which the pitch limit indicator on that airspeed indicator or on the PFD disappears. And that's my only visual indication of my stick shaker, of my stall warning. And so another one of the upgrades that we're doing is we're adding an enhanced stall warning computer to all of the 76300 aircraft at Delta, and that's going to give us a full-time PLI display. On the right side of your screen right there, just knowing your limits, we put these charts into the flight crew training manual, and so our pilots can see at 15 degrees of bank or at 2 Gs what their increase in stall speed is or what the margin is that they have to maneuvering speed. And I won't read those charts for you, but we've provided them to our pilots in all the training manuals. The display that you see there on the left, that's going to be the new display on the 7576 and just a host of information that's going to be available to the pilot that was not available on that airspeed indicator that we were just talking about. In the center there, as I mentioned, we have 2 subject matter experts on every fleet at all times. They go out to APS in Arizona and they spend a week flying with the team out there, going through academics and going through on-aircraft training, and then eventually delivering UPRT under supervision on the simulator until they get fully checked out as a UPRT instructor at Delta. And then they train the other instructors at Delta. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we take the FOQA data and ASAP data and subject matter experts and deliver FOQA-based training scenarios in initial training, upgrade training, recurrent training, what have you. All right, as we're looking to wrap up here, I want to share some tools for improvement that we are currently using at Delta, and some things that we're looking ahead to in our operation. So one of the tools that we currently use, and I think this is really essential, is an application that Delta uses called Widget Weather, and it gives type-specific forecast turbulence at all altitudes. It also gives the current turbulence report from all the aircraft that are operating in the system. I give cloud tops all around the world, and then also composite radar. And so when I'm looking at the altitude capability of the aircraft, for instance, and I'm seeing that I'm getting within, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet of the maximum altitude capability of that aircraft on that day, I'm looking very closely at this widget weather application, and I'm seeing what the forecast turbulence is ahead, and I'm looking at what the existing turbulence reports are on the aircraft around me to decide, do I really want to push this aircraft any closer to the maximum capability? Because in some cases, I might only have 1.3 G capability until I get into a stick shaker at max cruise, and I don't want to do that. And so I'm very carefully using this application to mitigate that risk and mitigate the threat, and consider actually flying at a lower altitude to increase the margin for the airspeed capability and the G capability. The second application that we're using online is called Flight Pulse, and what this does is this gives a personalized flight history to every single pilot at Delta. So at any given time, I can pull up Flight Pulse and I can see, have I had any unstable events? What level of automation was I using at a given point in the flight? It keeps a record of manual flight time. So now I know down to the second how many minutes and how many seconds I average flying on any given leg. And then it gives me the aggregate data and shows me how I compare to the other pilots at Delta. So I might have an average hand flying time of 5 minutes on any given flight, and another pilot may have 10, or the average might be 20 minutes across the airline. And I'm kind of making up numbers there, but it gives me an opportunity to compare myself to my peers and say, hey, maybe I should think about hand flying a little bit more. Or, hey, it looks like I've had some unstable approaches in the last 6 months. What could I have done to prevent that from occurring? And what can I do differently in the future to improve? So I think that's a really important application. This chart right here, I won't decipher all the numbers for you, but this is a chart that we provided to our Airbus 350 pilots after some high altitude alpha warning events that we had. And basically what it shows them is the altitude degradation based on an increase in temperature. So if you're flying around the equator and your ISA temperature begins to increase, how does that affect the altitude capability of the airplane? So if you have ISA plus 10 to 15, that reduces the altitude capability by 100 feet per degree Celsius. But if I start getting into really warm waters and really warm temperatures, that actually increases or reduces my altitude capability by 1,000 feet per degree of Celsius above ISA 15. Another reminder we put out to our pilots is that the altitude penalties that are associated with MELs need to be manually applied. That ended up being a causal factor in one of the events that we had. So anyway, these are just multiple ways that we have given our pilots to mitigate risk and mitigate threats on the operation. All right. Lastly here is a topic that has been circling in the industry for the last few years, and it's a topic we call loss of margin go around. And it doesn't fit into the traditional loss of control parameters of the 25 degrees nose up, 10 degrees nose down, 45 degrees of bank. Sometimes it does, but not always. It may be a go around that was initiated but didn't actually result in a climb within a specified period of time, or the configuration wasn't changed in an appropriate period of time, or perhaps ground contact became imminent for some reason. And so we're in the process of analyzing approximately 9,000 go-arounds that have occurred online, 75,000 go-arounds that have occurred in training. And then we're also looking at the qual standards that we train our pilots to. and trying to identify ways that we can train go-arounds better, but also execute them more safely online. So we haven't gotten to the bottom of that study yet, but we are in process of doing that now. And I think that's something that's going to be an important topic for the UPRT community moving forward. So as I wrap up here, there's kind of three key takeaways. First is analyze the data in your operation. Secondly is raise the bar in flight training. Use that data to train your pilots to proficiency. And then ultimately apply those skills and apply that knowledge that you've learned in training and share that on the line. And at the end of the day, if you're an instructor, whether you're a UPRT instructor or a line instructor, make sure that you are comfortable putting your own family on that airplane before you put them out there to the line. Ultimately, that's the standard at Delta. We have very objective training criteria, but at the end of the day, that's what I ask myself. Would I put my own wife and kids on that family before I send that pilot out the door? So thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I'm sorry that I can't take your questions live, but Randy, I see you're joining me now and would love to answer questions that you may have.
Brian, that was a powerful presentation with a lot of data. I want to hone in on one particular nugget because there was so much information that you provided that was valuable information. But let me get this straight. You said that in 5 million operations measured over a 5-year period at Delta Airlines since 2018, they had a 50% reduction in precursor events after the introduction of upset prevention and recovery training?
That is correct. We began upset recovery training, prevention and recovery training in 2018 and simultaneously began tracking the data. And we've seen almost a 50% reduction over that 5-year period. Yes, sir.
Well, Brian, I just want to congratulate Delta Airlines for sharing this information to help make the industry more safe. I want to thank you for your participation, and I hope that you're able to make contributions over on the other side of the world when we're doing our summit. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you, Randy. I appreciate it.
Wow, very powerful presentation. Thank you, Brian and Randy. Awesome, just truly excellent material in there. Well, let me introduce our next speaker. It is definitely my pleasure and honor to introduce Captain Brad Bennetts of Global Airways in South Africa, where he is a training captain on the A320. He has 20 plus years of flying Boeing's 737 and Airbus of different fleet types. He was an Airbus display pilot for South African Airways, and he has over 17,000 hours. Of particular importance today is his experience in the delivery of UPRT. He is arguably the world's leading practical UPRT implementation expert on the A320, A330, and A340 aircraft, to include vast experience implementing it in the Boeing 737. He has a grade 1 instructor rating. From an all-attitude experience point of view, he has 18 years of competition and air show display experience with over 600 low-level air show performances. His team, in fact, won 2 silver medals in the Grand Prix of Aerobatics in the UAE and Japan. He's an air show display authorization examiner in the South African Civil Aviation Authority. And of additional significance, for the last 8 years, he has been an APS certified Airbus type specific check airman and train the trainer instructor, our highest instructor rating at APS. So let's go over to Brad. He is easygoing, he's well-spoken, a true professional and expert, and he's a great friend. Brad?
Well, thank you, Clark, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone that has joined us this morning or this evening, depending on where you are on the globe at this moment. With an increase in technology, we are faced with the problem of a degradation of pilots' manual handling skills in some areas. However, on the positive side, as we've just seen, technology has enabled us to track safety trends through the collection of data and statistics, We're therefore able to measure the success of an effective UPRT training program. I'd like to thank Brian for sharing those incredible statistics from Delta Airlines. I'd even go so far as to say that in the history of commercial aviation, I don't think we've seen statistics that show such an impressive improvement in aviation safety, especially as we are considering the biggest threat to aviation, which is loss of control in flight. So well done to Brian and his team, as well as the management at Delta, for understanding the importance of having properly trained instructors teaching a proven and effective UPRT training program. Now, over the past 10 years and a few hundred simulator sessions teaching UPRT, I'd like to quote the one paragraph from the ICAO document 111 that everyone in aviation needs to pay particular attention to, including the regulators in the audience today. And I quote, "In UPRT, the safety implications and the consequences of applying poor instructional technique or providing misleading information are arguably more significant than in some other areas of pilot training. Aviation Performance Solutions needs to be commended for the work they do in providing the gold standard that saves lives, as well as providing the backup support that is needed for operators to implement this rather complex training program into their organizations." The following presentation, which many of you may be familiar with, is a cut-down version of a much longer presentation that is available through the APS website. It will hopefully provide you with much to contemplate as we look at how an effective UPRT training program that was delivered by properly trained instructors saved the lives of 259 people on board an Airbus A340. To cut straight to the chase, the analysis and final report produced 6 distinct phases in the event sequence, which I'll now summarize as follows. Phase 1 was the normal flight prior to the perturbation. The aircraft, an Airbus 340-600, was at a normal high-altitude cruise level, routing to Frankfurt overhead the Swiss Alps after nearly 10 hours of flight time. The flight deck crew had just finished their rotation, were prior to descent, and were preparing for the approach. The captain was the pilot flying, and it was his first solo flight on the Airbus after spending many years on Boeing aircraft as a domestic captain. Phase 2 was the upset and the overspeed that occurred. So a few minutes prior to descent, the aircraft was subjected to a rapid wind gradient, which was consistent with forecast mountain wave activity. Over a period of 14 seconds, there was a decrease of 41 knots in the tailwind which they were experiencing, and that resulted in a severe overspeed. The MMO of 0.86 was exceeded by Mach 0.03. At the peak of the overspeed, the trend vector was 30 knots above the indicated speed value, and the top of the trend vector at approximately Mach 0.937. Due to the fact that the speed trend vector was predicting a speed beyond MD, or max design speed, the overspeed was classed as severe. The combination of the rapid speed at which the overspeed occurred and the severe predictive trend meant that this overspeed contributed to crew startle and obviously the anticipation of significant potential harm. This overspeed also presented in a way that the simulators at South African Airways had not been able to recreate. It was, even for experienced crew, something they had never seen before of similar intensity. The overspeed warning became active and contributed to the surprise and startle effect of the crew, who had been at that stage in a relatively low workload environment. During the overspeed, the crew disconnected the autopilot. They received their fair share of criticism over this action, as the Airbus recommendation was to keep the autopilot engaged. However, there was a difference between what the flight crew expected of the automation and the system's actual behavior. Aspects that contributed to this difference in expectation included the SAA simulator standard. The Flight Control Primary Computer, or FCPC standard, of the 340-600 simulator was not the same as the FCPC standard that was installed in the aircraft. This meant that the simulator's automatic system behavior was different to the real aircraft. Now, during a severe overspeed, the crew's expectation was that the autopilot would disconnect and the high-speed protection would pitch the aircraft nose up. The FCOM describes the autopilot disconnect speed as Mach 0.89. However, when the aircraft reached Mach 0.892 and appeared to be accelerating towards maximum structural speed, the autopilot did not disconnect and the aircraft did not pitch up. The contributing factors that influenced the crew's decision to manually pitch the aircraft's nose up included the speed at which the situation developed, the trend prediction in the overspeed, the altitude loss due to the downdraft component of a mountain wave, the behavior of the automatic protection systems being different to what they were expecting, also the effect of surprise and stress on the crew to revert to simple, rule-based and intuitive actions to correct the overspeed. There was spatial disorientation that was caused by the illusion of an aircraft nose-down pitch, which we'll discuss a bit later. Evidence collected in the crew interviews and the FDR data, as well as the recreation of the event in the simulator, indicated that there was significant surprise and stress effects on the crew, which I'm sure you can understand. One of the crew actually described the fear sensation as having penetrated the deepest part of his body. Now we know that surprise and severe stress often cause crew to revert to simple, rule-based intuitive responses to deal with threats. The action of raising the aircraft nose to reduce the speed forms part of the foundational pilot knowledge on the primary and secondary effects of controls and is a normal practice to teach this skill at the beginning of pilot training. This creates what is referred to as primacy, which makes it very likely for a pilot to use when being subjected to stressful conditions. There was a lot of spatial disorientation. In oversimplistic terms, the aircraft entered a wall of air, i.e. the mountain wave. Upon entering this wave, the airspeed reading, which obviously uses dynamic air pressure, increased to show an overspeed. What was misleading about this representation of the speed is that it implied that the aircraft was accelerating, which was temporarily true from the airspeed perspective, but not from a longitudinal acceleration perspective. The flight data recorder data confirmed that the mountain wave caused longitudinal deceleration. So this presented conflicting sensory signals to the flight crew. What they saw visually was an apparent rapid increase in speed, and this conflicted with their vestibular sensation of slowing down. Now, the force that is applied to the pilot's vestibular system in the ears is known as gravito-inertial force. Using data from the flight data recorder, our human factors expert calculated and plotted the perceived pitch, which is shown in the red line on the graph, together with the actual pitch of the aircraft shown as a green line, and the captain's side stick position, which is shown as a black line on the graph. The analysis produced results that were actually quite significant. Before the overspeed, the perceived pitch in red and the actual pitch in green had less than 0.5 degrees difference. This small difference was due to the weakening of gravity at higher altitudes. In simple terms, the crew's perception of pitch and the aircraft's actual pitch were the same in stable flight. However, from the start of the mountain wave encounter to the start of the overspeed warning, the perceived pitch in red was decreasing and diverging to nose down, whilst the actual pitch of the aircraft in green was moving slightly nose up. This was due to the autopilot compensating for the altitude loss in the downdraft. When the divergence reached a maximum difference, the crew disengaged the autopilot and pulled the stick off to around 67% of maximum travel. So in simple terms, due to an illusion, the crew felt the nose was pitching down, and combined with the effect of surprise and startle, instinctively corrected this imbalance. The aircraft pitch, which is shown in green, increased to around 11 degrees following the side stick aft input. After the incident, the crew believed that the aircraft had actually automatically disengaged the autopilot and pitched the nose up. It was more than a month after the incident, and after analyzing the flight data recorder data, that the crew became aware that the pitch-up had actually been performed manually. This is classed as a Type 1 disorientation. In comes Phase 3, the next hole in the Swiss cheese model. This was in the form of the Airbus Operating Engineering Bulletin, or OEB 49. Now, OEB 49 was a red OEB. This indicated that it may have significant impact on the safety of the aircraft. OEB 49 was issued in response to an undue activation of the alpha protection system, or the aerodynamic stall protection system, which occurred on an A321 in 2014. The Airbus 321 lost 4,000 feet of altitude due to the alpha protection system erroneously reducing the angle of attack by pitching the nose down. The incident's probable cause included aspects relating to a damaged angle of attack vanes and ice formation. So this was published in the QRH and the FCOM, and the crew were required to read and review this OEB on every sector. The crew at that stage misinterpreted the scenario that was unfolding before them as the preconditions of the application of this OEB, and in so doing switched off ADRs 2 and 3. In doing so, the flight control law became alternate law, and the order thrust failed, which was as designed to do. Due to the overspeed, the order thrust had commanded idle thrust, so that when the ADRs 2 and 3 were turned off, the engine thrust locked at idle thrust. So it's important to understand from the crew's perspective. This moment is 9 seconds into a startling and high-risk event. In other words, the crew had 9 seconds under extreme duress and startle to process everything that we have discussed up to this point. The application of OEB 49 caused a cascade of warnings and cautions and had a profound effect on the startle and the stress effects at this critical moment. When combined with all the other complex factors that we've described up to now, it resulted in the aircraft climbing rapidly, at high altitude, with little automatic system protection, and the safety of the flight almost completely resting on the captain, who at that stage was the only one with working displays. At this moment in the sequence, the startle and the stress effect increased significantly. In Phase 4 of the event, which incorporated the speed decay and the crew's stress, we look at the next 24 seconds. The airspeed reduced to its lowest recorded value of 198 knots, and the thrust was sitting at around 36%. The captain stated that he had felt an extreme high level of stress during this period. He has large gaps in his memory as well. He does remember trying to concentrate on maintaining a constant and safe pitch attitude with wings level. At this point, the third pilot heard the oral stall warning of stall, stall, and noticed that the thrust and the speed was low and was decreasing. From the onset of the overspeed warning to the application of OEB 49 was 19 seconds. From the application of OEB 49 to the first stall warning was 25 seconds. In those 25 seconds, there was an information and warning overload. There was an altitude alert, a thrust lock chime, there were 3 VHF transmissions from ATC, the cockpit door buzzer sounded a few times from the cabin crew, and 25 seconds of master caution. So from a visual perspective, the co-pilot's screens had red warnings and no data. The captain's PFD had amber crosses from the alternate law indications, and the flight director would have been providing conflicting guidance. The master caution and the ECAM were producing caution lights and amber lights, and the FMA was flashing thrust lock in amber. So from a handling perspective, the captain was flying the aircraft manually, in alternate law, at high altitude for the first time ever, which due to maneuvering stability would have made manual flight handling of the aircraft very challenging. Interviews with the crew indicated gaps in their memory during this period, and we know that retrograde amnesia can be associated with periods of extremely high stress levels. Research has shown that this could be for up to 30 seconds. The captain, for example, only recalls trying to maintain wings level and a constant safe pitch attitude while feeling like he was in a state of shock. The last aspect that probably contributed to the crew's acute stress was the disruption of preconditioned expectancy. So pilots develop expectations of high reliability from their normal daily operations. The perceived failure of the system to adequately handle the event and the apparent malfunctions that occurred disrupted the crew's conditioned expectancy, which may have significantly added to their stress levels. At this point, as the airspeed decayed to the alpha stall warning, there was a breakdown in active scanning and monitoring of the speed scale. Each pilot was facing a different perspective and role, as we have said before, and a tremendous amount of information overload through the effects of high stress. Let's now look at phase 5 of the event, which is the approach to stall recovery. The conclusion at this stage was that the aircraft was in the approach to stall. The aircraft was at an altitude of 39,900 feet, and the grid mora over that area of the Swiss Alps was 16,600 feet. In simple terms, the aircraft was about to run out of lift. The single most important and critical act that the crew performed to avert catastrophe was the upset recovery maneuver. This brought the aircraft from a state of an approach to stall and loss of control into aerodynamic stability with control. As discussed previously, the crew had high stress levels, confusion about aircraft system state, but instead of an ineffective, incomplete or absent stall recovery, they had been properly trained to apply the APS all-attitude upset recovery strategy. The captain recalled hearing the oral stall warning as well as the feeling and aerodynamic buffet, and he responded by applying the recovery strategy. The co-pilot remembers thinking, "We're in big trouble. We had to get this aeroplane flying." He too was brought into the loop with the shouting of the upset recovery strategy. There were 3 cabin crew who reported feeling a rattle go through the aircraft like they'd never felt before. The captain, immediately after verbalizing the strategy, pushed the side stick forward to achieve a nose-low pitch of -6 degrees. During the initial moments of the recovery maneuver, the captain made 4 successive push and pull movements on the side stick. The stall warning activated 4 times, and the maximum recorded angle of attack value was 8.1 degrees. The investigation team and the Airbus's accident investigation representatives were in agreement that the conditions of high altitude, alternate law, low energy, this all provided a sluggish aircraft response to pitch commands, and that the oscillations were related to the unfamiliar circumstances for the pilot flying. The captain also took hold of the thrust levers during the power step of the strategy and started to manually advance the thrust, which at that stage had been locked at idle since the failure of the order thrust. The altitude dropped from 39,700 feet to 35,000 feet during the recovery, with the vertical speed ranging from -2,000 feet per minute to -6,200 feet per minute. Phase 6 of the event is the system's recovery to normal flight. So with the overspeed and the approach to stall resolved, the crew turned to dealing with the landing in Frankfurt, and once the aiders were re-engaged, the aircraft's flight control primary computers returned to normal law. The autopilots were re-engaged, and a safe landing was carried out in Frankfurt. So in summary, the stall warning and the APS upset prevention and recovery strategy provided the training for the cues, the goals, the actions, and the expectations that extracted the crew from this high stress and low situational awareness into attending critical priorities. The human factors expert referred to this type of action as recognized prime decision. The situation is assessed by understanding the goals that fit, increasing the importance of relevant cues, forming expectations by using mental models, and identifying typical actions required, all a function of the APS or latitude upset recovery strategy. I hope that by the end of the summit, everyone here will realize the importance of effective UPRT program training, the importance of having a properly trained instructor to deliver the program. Thank you for your time.
Brad, it's great to see you. Hey, thanks for that presentation. Really appreciate that. Obviously it's been a number of times since I've been able to hear about that incident, and we're definitely going to go into some more details here in this Q&A. But it's great to see you again. You're still over on the other side of the world. You're let's see, 9 hours ahead of me right now. They're in South Africa. They're in Cape Town, right? Didn't you just move to Cape Town?
Yeah, I did. Good evening, Otter, once again, and to everybody else joining us this evening or this morning, as I said, depending on where you are. It's a lovely spring evening, getting warm. So looking forward to a good summer. Lots of thunderstorms predicted for the next season. So I'm sure it's going to be a lot of exciting flying. And hopefully exciting days coming up ahead where we can use our training to mitigate or to prevent situations which in normal circumstances could lead to upset scenarios.
Yeah, for sure. Everybody, Brian Sims, who gave the first presentation there, is not going to be able to join us right now. He is on the other side of the world from his training center right now, actually delivering some UPRTs to some of the mission pilots. They're out where he grew up. So it's night. He just sent me a picture and video just the other day, or just yesterday, actually, of them landing on a jungle strip. So that was neat to see. But let's go into some of the questions here. We've already got at least 2 right now. I know I've got a number of questions and comments throughout as well. This one here, and I'm going to bring it up here. Pretty lengthy one. Thank you, Rodrigo. I apologize if I don't say names too correctly here, but I believe you wrote this one during Brian Sims' Delta presentation. You said, interesting point. Thanks for sharing that your airline limits the pitch to 20 degrees nose up. A point to note is that we have been discussing thrust to weight a lot. So if the engine thrust is high and weight is low, pitch attitude for the climb out or after a go around could exceed 20 degrees nose up. I would rather recommend training pilots to handle the aircraft in all thrust to weight ratios rather than limit the pitch to a fixed number. So just to remind everybody, I believe you're referring to the 767 or 757 issues that Delta was having about them rotating a little too slowly. And hence the PLI was actually, not the PLI, the flight directors were giving them higher than normal pitch attitudes in order to get them back on speed, get the speed back down to where it should be for the climb. And so if, Brad, you might want to comment on this. I believe one of their mitigations was to just say, all right, guys, don't follow the flight directors past 20 degrees nose up, right? And just limit the pitch attitude to 20 degrees. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, thanks, Rodrigo, for that question. Yeah, it was interesting to hear Brian's take on that. Obviously, the 757 under certain conditions and slow rotation rates has got a tremendous amount of thrust available. It's a lot more than what we see in the Airbus in terms of the amount that the nose up pitch occurs. Our Airbus, the SRS or speed reference system, will limit that pitch up to below 20 degrees. So I think obviously, as Brian said, training pilots to prevent that situation by rotating correctly would sort the problem out. It obviously happens in manual flight and not on autopilot. I'm sure the autopilot would probably follow the flight directors to exceed 20 degrees nose up if it was on autopilot at that stage. But manual handling for the crew is probably something that he's focusing on there. and just giving the aircraft a chance at 20 degrees nose up for the speed to catch up, so to speak, so that the speed can then stabilize back at the correct speed for the climb. I hear what Rodrigo is saying, is that pilots should be trained to handle that as well. But obviously their FOCO data, or the parameters around which exceedances trigger, affects their safety plans and safety data. And their data, their exceedances obviously triggered at around 20 degrees nose up. So they're obviously trying to avoid the triggering of exceedances into their data as well.
Yes. For me, he's mentioning what we see in UPRT with a lot of pilots, that seems to be a challenge for a lot of pilots, and that is really energy management, because that's really kind of what we're talking about. Pitch plus power equals performance, right? Here. And Brad, I know you saw this was a challenge in your pilots there. And so energy management training was an important aspect there, giving pilots better understanding of pitch and power relationships in the different phases of flight envelope is pretty important to mitigate for sure some of these undesired aircraft states. Would you agree with that we don't seem to be doing a real good job of teaching pilots appropriate energy management? It's just in general, there's just this, all right, if I need speed, throw the throttle up. If I need less speed, you pull the throttle. And there's a whole lot more to it than that.
Yeah. Well, one would assume that a pilot has got that background training by the time they join an airline, in terms of the relationship between pitch, power, and attitude. But I think, in our situation, our training programs are very tight. We've got a lot that we need to do in a short space of time. We're taking on pilots that haven't flown for a few years due to COVID. We've got a lot of pilots that were on furlough, and we now putting them through type ratings, and it's a hell of a lot of work for them to get through a type rating, just dealing with what the OEM's syllabus is. So that is why a separate and extra UPRT session is vital to remind these pilots. Some of them have never flown big jets. Others last flew big jets a while ago. The relationship between performance at low altitude and and up at high altitude as well. So what we do is we look at the effects of thrust at low altitude, how much thrust is available. We look at the maneuvering envelope at a lower altitude compared to a high altitude. And what's important as well is the pitch change, in terms of the performance that you're going to get per degree of pitch change, is significantly different at low altitude compared to high altitude. For instance, at low altitude, any altitude, if you double your TAS, you should get the rate of climb per degree pitch change. So low altitude, around 250 knots TAS, you're going to get a 500 feet per minute rate of climb. If we had to change the pitch by 5 degrees, that would equivalent to 2,500 feet per minute rate of climb. And then you take the pilots up to high altitude, where most of them haven't flown the simulator, never mind the real airplane, at 35,000 to 37,000 feet. Show them the effect of changing pitch there, and 1 degree will give you 800 to 900 feet a minute rate of climb, depending on your Mach number. So a 5 degree pitch change in that case is close to 4,000 feet per minute rate of climb. So that's almost double what you would get for a 5 degree pitch change at high altitude compared to low altitude. And that really surprises a lot of pilots. They had no idea that is actually the case. So that kind of training as a prevention strategy is vital.
And this didn't this really kind of come into play for this particular A340 crew? Because as you said, he's now hand flying the airplane in alternate law at high altitude for the first time in his life, was probably somewhat unaware of that energy loss with his nose up input. There, it decreased, or the loss of energy happened much quicker than they expected.
Yeah, and it would have been a lot worse, Clark, if they hadn't had the training. After chatting to the captain, yes, maneuvering stability at high altitude was a lot less due to the lower damping effect. They had been shown that in the simulator. They were aware of the small, subtle changes that one needs to make to the attitude at high altitude. But here was a pilot who was subject to extreme stress.
Yeah.
Having to fly the airplane in real life for the first time at that altitude, and I think his training in the simulator, as he said, when he heard the stall warning sound, it was almost a relief for him, because he now knew what was going on. He knew that it was a situation that he could deal with. He knew that he had a strategy to apply. He had been trained in how to do this. It wasn't a case of life and death anymore. He could now fly his way out of that situation. So the strategy itself extracted him from the startle, from the fight or flight type syndrome, where your prefrontal cortex sort of goes into shutdown mode. It extracted him out of that situation and put him got him to a situation where he was able to start functioning as a pilot again, and save the situation.
I think that's fascinating, and it's really neat that you had a human factors expert on that incident investigation that contributed a lot to this. We can certainly go more into that here. Let's just continue with this incident here a second, because one of the things obviously that was significant was this 41 knot tailwind decrease that gave them this longitudinal acceleration deceleration perception difference there. And it's probably, a lot of pilots probably never thought about that, never thought about how that kind of thing could affect you there. And did you find, when you were giving the UPRT to the guys, that I know you did a lot of training along this high speed area? We noticed that a lot of pilots are unaware of the difference or margin of speed difference between MMO and MD there. And I know you talked with them about that. Is that right, in your program?
Yeah, well, they get trained on the maneuvering envelope, the VG diagram, and how MD fits into that maneuvering envelope. So there are situations which can occur, and I think Brian talked a lot about it in his presentation with regards to the Airbus aircraft, which are what he referred to as nose low upsets, which I would assume is more overspeed upsets caused by a nose low situation. So in some cases, the same pitch attitude of those Airbuses that Brian was mentioning might not be defined as an upset because the speed might be correct. But at high altitude, we've got a similar problem with our Airbuses as well, because of the cost of fuel. The idle factors of the aircraft have been changed. And what happens is, if you prolong or you start your descent a bit late, or the winds change and you end up a bit high on the profile at high altitude, the target speed for the Airbus range, which is designed to help you stay on profile, gets very close to VMO. It's almost within a couple of knots. And if the aircraft lowers its nose to move towards the upper end scale of the target range, quite often you'll end up in MMO, which then will trigger a class 3 exceedance. And the guys who had been trained on the Airbus 340-600 had been shown that should an overspeed occur, there's still a how would you say it? There's still a margin there before one reaches MD or VD, which is where the Airbus has been tested to, and it shouldn't result in massive startle. The autopilot disconnects well into VMO. Well, not well into VMO, but there is a margin where the autopilot. So the aeroplane can actually fly into VMO, and the autopilot will not protect it until it reaches a specific speed. So it's okay to transit into the lower edge of VMO without getting absolutely startled. And I think that helped the pilots a lot. But one of the big problems was that the speed trend vector was so high, and it was something that they'd never seen in a simulator before. And that is what caused this massive startle. And of course, the gravito-inertial effect of feeling as if the nose had pitched down. Now, remember, the captain was busy programming the FMGC for a Cat 2 landing in Frankfurt. The weather was pretty bad when suddenly he had to deal with an overspeed warning. When he looked up, it felt as if the nose had pitched down, and he saw a huge increase in speed, which he had never ever seen in a simulator before. Our upgraded simulators, the iOSs, which are upgraded for UPRT, can do a much better job of simulating that kind of overspeed. Maybe not to the extent that we saw in the 340, but it certainly helps with UPRT training for overspeed events.
Okay. Great. Let's go to this next one here from Timothy. How many of your Delta cadre have been through the on-aircraft UPRT training? Now, he's, of course, referring to Brian when he talked about they have 2 subject matter experts per fleet type that they have. And I'll answer this one since, Brian, I know the answer to this, and it is 2. Each of those SMEs will come to receive on-aircraft training. That happens to be with us, so they will all come out here to Phoenix. But they do consider that these UPRT SMEs, or subject matter experts that they have on property, need to have gone through a robust on-aircraft UPRT program, because they feel like the human factors training that you're going to get out of real on-aircraft UPRT is far more significant and worthy of learning compared to simulator only UPRT. Now, that's obviously what the line pilots are ultimately going to receive, because they're not forcing all their line pilots to come out there. But the industry, I think, envisioned for all pilots eventually to have had on-aircraft UPRT before they ever get to the airline there. And then they just get their type-specific UPRT once they're at the airline. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, Timothy. Hey, Brad, along that line, you did the same thing, right? At your airline with your subject matter experts, your UPRT experts, you had them go to on-aircraft training. Is that right?
Absolutely, Clark. We came through to APS to have a look at the course before UPRT was a legislative requirement. And I'd flown a tremendous amount of aerobatics, and that was probably why I was selected to go and evaluate the course. But after having done the course, I realized that, yes, I had the knowledge and probably the all-attitude experience to be able to teach recovery from upsets. But what I didn't understand was how the effect of startle and how important it is to translate the effect of startle to the students. The instructors really had to have that immersive experience in order to teach this properly. Really, it's absolutely imperative. So when I came back from APS, it was the first thing I said was all instructors that are teaching or becoming SMEs, dedicated UPRT instructors, had to go for on-aircraft training. So we had 12 instructors over a period of a few years that attended the course. Half of them had all-attitude experience. A couple of them were significant pedigrees as aerobatic champions We had a world aerobatic champion. We had guys that had flown hundreds of air shows who we chose, along with guys that had no all-latitude experience. But just back to the guys that did have that experience, they came back from the training and said it was totally different to what they had thought it would be. They had a new found respect of how to teach UPRT and how important it is to have that effective startle, to have experienced it, so that they could then help train students and to correctly assess the performance of students that they were training.
So would you then recommend to airlines that if they're considering trying to get their senior instructors or get subject matter experts on property related to UPRT, would you recommend then that those SMEs get on aircraft training? Because I'm aware of a number of train the trainer programs out there in the industry that will train airlines in UPRT, but they're only doing it in the simulator or academically, and they're not putting them through on aircraft. Would you say that's a critical component though?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I recently trained a pilot who had himself received UPRT on the Airbus, and he was quite taken aback by the effects that I was describing to him of what, for instance, a proper unload would feel like should you be in a nose high situation.
Yeah.
He had been taught completely incorrectly because the previous instructor had not experienced the situation on aircraft UPRT himself, and that would have actually, his actions would have resulted in damage to the aircraft as well as potential loss of life, as we have seen before in some accidents where unloading too much has actually caused fatalities on board, you know.
Yep.
Yeah, so 100%. It's, you know, it's really not a big cost in the bigger scheme of things to send a core group of pilots to do on-aircraft UPRT training, and then to have them teach instructors down the line to then teach the line. So one has to obviously be careful of instructor drift, and you have to have your core group monitoring closely what is being taught and how it's being taught. But that core group, be it 2 pilots or whatever, you know, however big your organization is really not a big expense for the quality that you're going to get in terms of UPRT. And as I said earlier on in my briefing, the potential for negative training or the potential for incorrect training has far bigger consequences than in any other type of training. It has to be taken seriously.
I totally agree with you. Totally agree. And I thought that was a great quote you made. And it is one worthy of thinking about if you're out there in the airlines and considering training. Wow, there have been some very serious negative training that's gone on, and it has led directly to airline accidents, as well as not only people hurt, but fatalities due to the incorrect techniques and methodologies that were taught. So great point. Let's go to another question here. I may have to throw this one at you for sure, Brad. Is it also in Airbus that use of speed brakes to be used in speed exceedances? Why don't we answer that question first? Well, let's just go. Would like to know more about safe margins, risk mitigation over the Himalayas, which has usual mountain waves and jet stream exceeding more than 100 knots. All right. So what about the use of speed brakes in exceeding, say, VMO or MMO in the Airbus?
So Airbus put out I think it was a safety first article shortly after this incident with the A340-600, where they focused a lot on high-speed excursions and recovery from high-speed exceedances or overspeed situations. We had trained overspeeds during our initial type ratings. You demonstrate overspeeds. There's almost sort of a memory item or memory drill that one has to use for an overspeed. But it wasn't focused on a lot, because one thinks that it's a simple overspeed. You're going to apply a speed brake and keep the automatics engaged, and the aeroplane will recover. One doesn't realize that something like that could lead to such a potential catastrophe. It's very important, and now we focus a lot on making sure that our pilots apply the correct technique for speed exceedances. We're able with our iOS to simulate a mild, moderate, or severe overspeed. And we can do that during a TCAS maneuver, as an example, where there is a bit of startle because the guys are busy trying to apply the correct TCAS memory items, when suddenly the speed starts increasing towards veer mode due to the fact that they're pushing the nose down to avoid the other traffic. And one can see straight away that the technique they apply is incorrect by closing the thrust levers as a instinctive reaction. So speed brake, obviously the first thing one does is reduce speed, selected speed, and then a cautious application of speed brake until such time as you're out of the overspeed situation. Speed brake on the Airbus does raise the VLS, and it does increase the stall speed of the aircraft, so one has to be quite careful about that. But I think Airbus does a great job of explaining that properly in their techniques manual on how to use speed brake properly.
Okay, great. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We're going to have to pause here. Gang, I know we didn't get to all of the questions, definitely a few left. Please feel free to write in to us at any time. But I thank everyone here. Yeah, I thank everyone for joining us. Hey, if you didn't get your questions answered, join us on session 4. We're going to have a massive Q&A there. You'll get a chance to ask your questions again over there. Brad, again, thank you so much for joining us on this great presentation. And again, it's great to be with you. Thank you for your leadership out there and expertise in this area.
Thanks, Clark. And if there's anybody that does have questions that you need me specifically to answer, feel free to just send the email and I'll get back to you.
That's great.
Via yourselves.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you in the next sessions.